General Alfred Jodl once said about George Patton, he was the American Guderian. He was very bold and preferred large movements. He took big risks and won big successes. However, opinions of Allied leadership among German generals varied widely, from grudging respect to outright dismissal, shaped by battlefield experiences and ideological biases that evolved dramatically throughout the war. These differing perceptions provide a glimpse into the minds of those who fought against the Allies, revealing not just military assessments but deeply personal reactions to defeat, ideology, and the changing nature of modern warfare. By examining their views, we gain insights into the strategic thinking that influenced World War II and discover how professional soldiers reconciled their respect for enemy commanders with the propaganda they were fed by their own regime. Let's delve into how German generals regarded their Allied counterparts and how these opinions shifted as the war progressed from triumph to disaster. Of all the Allied generals, there was one who stood out in the eyes of the German High Command. A commander so aggressive, so relentless in his pursuit of victory, that he earned a grudging respect from his enemies that bordered on genuine admiration. George Smith Patton Jr., the flamboyant American general born on November 11, 1885, was seen by many German officers as a kindred spirit. A man who understood warfare the way they did. In fact, some went so far as to consider him the most German of the Allied commanders, a statement that carried profound meaning in the Wehrmacht's professional circles. But what exactly did they mean by that? What was it about Patton that resonated so deeply with men who were fighting desperately against him? Patton's approach to warfare aligned closely with the German military philosophy that had dominated European battlefields since the Franco-Prussian War. He believed in constant movement, rapid advances, and overwhelming force applied at the decisive point. This style of combat was eerily familiar to the German generals, reminiscent of their own blitzkrieg tactics that had swept across Poland and France in the early years of the war. Patton understood what the Germans had long known, that modern warfare was about speed, shock, and maintaining the initiative at all costs. Static warfare, the grinding attrition of World War I, was anathema to everything he believed in as a soldier. Patton's aversion to static warfare was legendary and sometimes expressed in ways that shocked even his own troops. He once famously urinated into a slit trench meant for protection, declaring with characteristic bluntness, "There, now try to use it." This disdain for fixed positions resonated deeply with the German commanders who valued mobility above all else, who had built their entire tactical doctrine around the concept of Bewegungskrieg, or war of movement. They saw in Patton a reflection of their own beliefs, a validation that their approach to warfare transcended nationality and ideology. Heinz Guderian, born on June 17, 1888, the mastermind behind Germany's blitzkrieg strategy and the father of modern armoured warfare, couldn't help but admire Patton's tactical prowess despite fighting on opposite sides. He had spent the 1930s developing the theories and practices that would revolutionise warfare, advocating for massed tank formations when many senior officers still saw armour as infantry support. When he encountered Patton's operations in the historical record, he recognised a fellow visionary. Guderian said with evident professional respect, "I hear much about General Patton, and he conducted a good campaign. From the standpoint of a tank specialist, I must congratulate him on his victory since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place." This was extraordinary praise from a man who had literally written the book on armoured warfare, whose Achtung Panzer had become the Bible of mechanised combat. But it wasn't just Guderian who held Patton in high regard. The admiration extended throughout the German officer corps, particularly among those who had faced him in battle. General Gunther Blumentritt, who was a key planner of the invasions of France and Poland and served as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, described Patton as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a title that carried immense weight coming from someone who had helped orchestrate some of Germany's greatest military triumphs. Blumentritt had seen the best commanders Germany had to offer, had worked alongside men like Manstein and Rommel, and yet he singled out Patton for special recognition. He noted with professional appreciation, "His operations impressed us enormously, probably because he came closest to our own concept of the classical military commander." The word classical was carefully chosen. It suggested that Patton embodied timeless military virtues that transcended the temporary circumstances of the war. However, the German view of Patton wasn't universally positive or uncomplicated. Some commanders saw him more as a tactical genius than a strategic mastermind, a distinction that mattered greatly in German military thinking, which drew sharp lines between operational and strategic levels of warfare. They acknowledged his brilliance in executing operations, but questioned whether he possessed the broader vision necessary for grand strategy. When discussing the overall Allied command structure, these officers focused their attention on figures like Bernard Montgomery and Dwight Eisenhower when it came to strategic planning, viewing Patton as someone who excelled at the operational level but needed direction from above. Patton's command style also drew parallels with the German concept of Auftragstaktik, or mission-type orders, a system that had been central to Prussian and German military doctrine for generations. This approach emphasized giving broad directives and allowing subordinate commanders to use their initiative on the battlefield, trusting their judgment and adaptation to changing circumstances rather than micromanaging from headquarters. Patton himself had absorbed this philosophy, whether through his extensive study of military history or through instinctive understanding. He once said with characteristic directness, "Never tell people how to do things. Tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity." This statement could have come from any German general staff officer discussing the principles of command, and it explains why German commanders felt such kinship with Patton despite being mortal enemies. Yet, for all the admiration, there was also pointed criticism that revealed the complexities of professional military assessment. Some German officers felt Patton's rapid advance in Sicily during the summer of 1943 was more about personal glory than strategic necessity. They noted that he had essentially raced Montgomery to Messina in what amounted to a competition between Allied commanders rather than a coordinated effort to trap the evacuating German and Italian forces. Military historian Harry Yide even described Patton's rush to Messina as a display of empty glory, a harsh judgment that some German observers shared. They pointed out that while Patton was racing along coastal roads to reach Messina first, the bulk of the Axis forces were successfully evacuating across the Strait of Messina to fight another day on the Italian mainland. It's important to note that the Germans had a tradition of strict evaluation that went back to the reforms of the early 19th century. They weren't easily impressed by a single campaign, no matter how successful. The German General Staff had cultivated a culture of brutal honesty in assessing both their own operations and those of their enemies, a practice that sometimes bordered on the unforgiving. Because of their own pool of experienced armoured commanders, men who had led panzer divisions across Russia and North Africa, Patton's reputation, while notable, wasn't as dominant in their eyes as you might expect. They had their own legends: Rommel, Guderian, Manstein, Model. Patton was impressive, certainly, but he was operating in a different context with vastly different resources. In fact, some German military historians pointed out that Patton's logistical accomplishments, while impressive on their own terms, were often overshadowed by the sheer scale of resources available to the Allies. They noted that Patton could afford to be aggressive because he knew that fuel, ammunition and replacements would flow to him in quantities that German commanders could only dream of by 1944. This led to a perception that Allied victories were due more to material superiority than individual skill, a view that helped German officers preserve their professional pride even in defeat. They could acknowledge that Patton was good while maintaining that German commanders would have been even more successful with similar resources. The logistical dimension of this assessment reveals something important about how the Germans viewed the entire Allied war effort. They distinguished between tactical skill, which they respected, and strategic advantage, which they attributed to American industrial might. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in Italy and faced both British and American armies, observed that Allied commanders could take risks that German generals could not, because Allied supply lines were secure and abundant. If an American attack failed, Kesselring noted, they could simply regroup and try again with fresh troops and new equipment. German commanders rarely had that luxury, especially in the war's later years. So while Patton was respected for his aggressive tactics and mobility-focused strategy, the German view of him was complex and nuanced. They saw in him a reflection of their own military philosophy, but also a beneficiary of America's vast industrial might. This paradox, a German-style general in American uniform backed by unlimited resources, made Patton a fascinating figure to his enemies, one they both admired and sought to understand. Some German officers later admitted in post-war interviews that they had studied Patton's movements carefully, trying to predict his next move based on their understanding of armoured warfare doctrine. They knew he would always choose the aggressive option, would always seek to outflank and encircle rather than attack frontally. In this sense, Patton was predictable to them, but his predictability didn't make him less dangerous. It simply meant they knew that stopping him would require matching his aggression with their own tactical skill, something that became increasingly difficult as Germany's resources dwindled. The German assessment of Patton also revealed their frustration with what they saw as Allied command politics. They noted that Patton was sometimes held back by Eisenhower and Montgomery, restrained when he wanted to drive deep into Germany. Some German commanders later speculated that if Patton had been given free rein earlier, if he had been allowed to pursue his instincts without political constraints, the war might have ended months sooner. Whether this assessment was accurate or simply a convenient explanation for their own defeat remains a matter of debate. But it shows that German generals were paying close attention not just to battlefield tactics, but to the command dynamics within the Allied coalition. What emerges from all these assessments is a portrait of how professional soldiers viewed each other across the battle lines. Despite the ideological chasm between Nazi Germany and the Western Allies, despite the propaganda that painted the enemy as either subhuman or decadent, German generals could still recognize and respect military skill when they saw it. Patton embodied qualities they valued: aggressiveness, tactical intuition, personal courage, and a commitment to offensive action. That he used these qualities against them was beside the point when it came to professional assessment. They could hate what he represented while respecting how he fought. While Patton's aggressive tactics earned him respect among German commanders, their view of British leadership was quite different and far more complicated. You might think the Germans saw their British adversaries as pushovers, outclassed by superior German tactics and training, but the reality was far more complex and interesting. In fact, German generals held a surprising level of respect for British forces, particularly when it came to their resilience and professionalism, qualities that German officers valued highly in any military organisation. However, this respect for British soldiers often existed in tension with their views on British generalship, creating a paradox that shaped German strategy throughout the war. General Siegfried Westphal, a high-ranking German officer who served in North Africa and Italy, and later became Deputy Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Kesselring, once remarked with evident sincerity, "The hardest, toughest in attack, and most persistent in defence were the British divisions." This wasn't just empty praise or post-war politeness. German military assessments consistently highlighted what they called the uniformity of the British personnel, and their remarkable absence of failures in key battles where other Allied forces had faltered. It's clear that the Germans saw something special in the British fighting spirit, something that commanded respect even from officers who had spent years trying to destroy the British Empire. The German respect for British soldiers had deep historical roots. Many German officers had studied the British Army's performance in World War I, where British divisions had demonstrated remarkable tenacity in the trenches of the Western Front. They remembered that it was British forces who had borne much of the burden in the grinding battles of the Somme and Passchendaele, suffering enormous casualties but never breaking. This institutional memory informed their assessments of British performance in World War II. When German commanders planned operations against British forces, they assumed they would face determined resistance and planned accordingly. Despite this admiration for British troops at the regimental and divisional level, German commanders often viewed British leadership at the higher levels as overly cautious and predictable. In the fast-paced world of mechanized warfare that had emerged in World War II, hesitation could be deadly, and the Germans felt that British generals too often chose caution over boldness. This perception was shaped by encounters in North Africa, where British offensives often seemed to lose momentum just when aggressive pursuit might have destroyed German forces entirely. General Erwin Rommel, the The famous Desert Fox, who had earned his reputation fighting the British in North Africa, expressed this frustration when he said to captured British officers after the siege of Tobruk in June 1942, "Gentlemen, you have fought like lions and been led by donkeys." Rommel's comment, whether he actually said exactly those words or not, captured a sentiment that was widely shared among German commanders who fought the British. They saw a disconnect between the quality of British soldiers and the decisions made by their commanders. The British private soldier, the corporals and sergeants, the junior officers leading platoons and companies, these men were first-rate in German eyes. But when it came to the generals making the big decisions, the Germans often saw men who were too bound by doctrine, too cautious, too slow to seize opportunities that appeared on the battlefield. This assessment wasn't entirely fair, of course. British generals were operating under different constraints than their German counterparts. They were more accountable to political leadership, more concerned with casualties given Britain's limited manpower, and more aware that a single disastrous defeat might knock Britain out of the war entirely. The Germans, especially in the early years of the war, could afford to take greater risks because they had more margin for error. But German generals either didn't understand these constraints or didn't care. From their perspective, war was war, and hesitation was weakness regardless of the reasons behind it. Of course, no discussion of German views on the British would be complete without mentioning Adolf Hitler's perspective, which was bizarrely contradictory and deeply influenced by his racial ideology. Hitler's view towards Britain was much more complicated than that of his generals because it was filtered through the lens of Nazi racial theory rather than military pragmatism. In Hitler's mind, the British were potential natural allies for Germany, a notion that seems absurd given that Britain and Germany were locked in a life-or-death struggle. He saw them as fellow Aryans, members of the supposed master race that he believed should be working with Germany rather than against it in the construction of a new European order. But what was the purpose of their conflict? How did Hitler reconcile his admiration for Britain with the reality that British forces were killing German soldiers and bombing German cities? Hitler believed that Jews were manipulating the British, turning them against Germany through their supposed control of British politics, finance, and media. This bizarre worldview allowed Hitler to justify his war against Britain while maintaining a twisted form of respect for them, a respect that occasionally manifested in orders that made little military sense. His decision to halt German tanks short of Dunkirk in May 1940, allowing over 300,000 British and French troops to escape, may have been influenced by this strange hope that Britain would come to terms once France fell. This ideological confusion at the highest level affected German strategy in subtle but important ways. The respect for British resilience meant that German commanders often prepared for tough, prolonged engagements when facing British forces. They knew that even if they gained an initial advantage, the British were likely to dig in and fight hard, rather than retreat or surrender. German battle plans against British positions typically allocated more time and resources than similar operations against other Allied forces. This wasn't a reflection of British tactical superiority so much as British determination and discipline, qualities the Germans recognised and planned for. At the same time, the perception of cautious British leadership led to some interesting tactical choices by German commanders. They sometimes took calculated risks, betting that their British counterparts would react slowly to unexpected moves. This aggressive approach occasionally paid off spectacularly, as in Rommel's first offensive in North Africa in March 1941, when he caught British forces off balance and drove them back hundreds of miles. However, it could also backfire tremendously when British forces proved more adaptable and skillful than expected, as happened at El Alamein in October 1942, where Montgomery's carefully planned offensive shattered Rommel's defensive lines. One area where German respect for British capabilities was particularly evident was in the air war. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest associates, grudgingly acknowledged British technological expertise, despite his public bombast about German air superiority. He said with evident frustration, "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. The British knocked together a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory over there is building, and they give it a speed which they have now increased yet again." The de Havilland Mosquito, built largely of wood to save scarce metal resources, could outrun most German fighters and proved almost impossible to intercept when flying at high altitude. This admiration for British engineering and innovation influenced German aircraft development throughout the war, spurring efforts to match British technological advances. The German Air Force's struggle against the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain in 1940 had also left a lasting impression on German commanders. They had learned that British pilots were skilled, their aircraft were competitive, and their command and control system, with its integrated radar network and fighter direction, was superior to anything Germany possessed. This experience tempered German confidence and made them wary of British air power throughout the rest of the war. Even in 1944 and 1945, when the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, German ground commanders worried about operations in areas where the RAF could intervene. In the end, the German perspective on British forces was a mix of respect, frustration, and grudging admiration. They saw their opponents as tough and professional, well-trained and well-disciplined, but sometimes held back by overly cautious leadership that failed to exploit the qualities of the soldiers under their command. This complex view shaped German strategy and tactics throughout the conflict, often in ways that had profound impacts on the course of the war. When planning operations, German commanders knew they could expect fierce resistance from British units, but also hoped that British generals would give them opportunities through slow or predictable responses. This assessment would be tested repeatedly throughout the war in North Africa, Italy, and Northwest Europe, with results that varied depending on which British commanders were involved. Men like Montgomery proved more aggressive and unpredictable than Germans expected, while others confirmed German stereotypes about British caution. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any generalization could capture, but German generals continued to rely on their assessments because they needed some framework for understanding their enemy. Whether accurate or not, these views influenced decisions that affected thousands of lives and the outcome of campaigns that shaped the modern world. The case of Bernard Law Montgomery deserves special attention in any discussion of German views on British leadership. Born on November 17, 1887, Montgomery came to prominence as commander of the British 8th Army in North Africa, where he finally stopped Rommel's advance at El Alamein. German officers had mixed feelings about Montgomery that revealed much about their own tactical preferences and strategic thinking. Some saw him as the embodiment of everything they disliked about British generalship: methodical, cautious, overly dependent on material superiority. Others recognized in him a formidable opponent who had learned from earlier British failures and adapted accordingly. Rommel himself had complicated views on Montgomery. On one hand, he respected Montgomery's thoroughness and ability to husband resources. On the other hand, he felt that Montgomery lacked the boldness necessary for truly decisive victories. After his defeat at El Alamein, Rommel noted that Montgomery had won not through tactical brilliance, but through overwhelming superiority in men and material, a judgment that conveniently overlooked Montgomery's skillful deception plans and the difficult night battle that broke through German defences. This tendency to attribute Allied victories to material advantage rather than tactical skill was common among German commanders and helped them preserve their sense of professional superiority even in defeat. Other German generals were more generous in their assessment of Montgomery. They noted that he had transformed the 8th Army from a defeated force into a confident, aggressive formation that pursued the Germans across North Africa. They observed that Montgomery understood the importance of morale and took great care to prepare his troops psychologically for battle. Some even suggested that Montgomery's caution was actually a strength in the context of British constraints, as it minimized casualties while still achieving objectives. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, though hardly an objective observer given his role as Hitler's loyal subordinate, admitted that Montgomery was a very prudent, very careful commander who never attacked until he had assembled completely overwhelming force. The German view of British commanders extended beyond Montgomery and Rommel to include assessments of earlier commanders as well. General Archibald Wavell, who commanded British forces in the Middle East in 1940 and 1941, earned German respect for his offensive in Libya that destroyed the Italian 10th Army and captured over 130,000 prisoners. However, German commanders also noted that Wavell seemed overstretched when forced to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously in North Africa, Greece, and Iraq. They saw this as a failure of British grand strategy rather than Wavell personally, but it confirmed their view that British commanders worked best when they could concentrate force rather than when required to improvise across wide areas. General Claude Auchinleck, who succeeded Wavell and preceded Montgomery in North Africa, presented an interesting case. German commanders who faced him during Operation Crusader in late 1941 and the First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942 recognized that he was more aggressive than his reputation suggested. Auchinleck's willingness to attack with incomplete preparations and to take risks when necessary surprised Germans who expected typical British caution. Some German officers later suggested that Auchinleck might have been the most dangerous British commander in North Africa if he had been given the resources and time that Montgomery received. The German assessment of British leadership in other theatres followed similar patterns. In Italy, German commanders respected the difficulty of the Allied advance up the peninsula, but felt that British and American generals were too predictable in their methods. Field Marshal Kesselring, who conducted a masterful defensive campaign in Italy, noted that Allied attacks followed a pattern: heavy bombardment, infantry assault, pause to consolidate, then repeat. This predictability allowed German defenders to prepare and fall back in good order, trading space for time while inflicting maximum casualties on the attackers. In Northwest Europe after D-Day, German generals found themselves facing Montgomery again, this time as ground forces commander for the Allied invasion. Their views on his performance at Normandy were characteristically mixed. They acknowledged that the landings had succeeded and that Montgomery had achieved his objective of drawing German armour onto the British and Canadian sectors, facilitating the American breakout. However, they also noted that Montgomery had failed to capture Caen on the first day as planned and that his subsequent operations around Caen had been costly and slow. Some German commanders suggested that a more aggressive Allied strategy might have broken out of Normandy weeks earlier, though this ignored the very real challenges of fighting in the dense bocage country of Normandy. What emerges from all these assessments is that German generals saw British commanders as competent professionals, who generally avoided serious mistakes but rarely achieved the kind of devastating victories that German doctrine prized. The Germans valued the Kesselschlacht, the battle of encirclement and annihilation, exemplified by Cannae in ancient times and by their own victories in Poland and France. British generals, in the German view, fought battles of attrition instead, grinding down German forces through superior resources rather than destroying them through superior tactics. This judgment was partly accurate and partly self-serving, as it allowed German officers to maintain their belief in the superiority of German military thinking, even as they were losing the war. It's also worth noting that German assessments of British commanders were influenced by class and social factors that both armies shared. The German officer corps and the British officer corps both drew heavily from their nation's traditional elites and shared certain assumptions about military professionalism and gentlemanly conduct. This sometimes created a strange mutual respect that transcended the brutal nature of their combat. German generals captured by British forces often reported being treated with courtesy and even deference by their captors, who recognized them as fellow professionals. This didn't mean they liked each other or agreed about anything, but it did mean they could understand each other's military thinking in ways that were sometimes difficult with Soviet or American commanders who came from different military traditions. The contrast in how German generals viewed British leadership versus British soldiers reveals an important truth about military effectiveness. An army is only as good as both its soldiers and its commanders, and the Germans recognized that Britain had excellent soldiers who were sometimes held back by overly cautious generalship. Whether this assessment was entirely fair is debatable, but it shaped German tactical and operational planning throughout the war and contributed to German confidence that they could continue fighting effectively even when outnumbered. While German opinions of British and American forces were complex and evolved over time, their view of the Soviet military underwent a dramatic transformation that was perhaps the most profound shift in perception experienced by any Wehrmacht commander during the war. The German perception of Soviet forces varied significantly over the course of the war, moving from contempt and dismissal to fear and grudging respect. Initially, many Germans underestimated the capabilities of the Soviets, viewing them as a less competent adversary whose forces would collapse under the weight of German military superiority. This was not merely professional miscalculation, but was deeply rooted in Nazi ideology that painted an entire people as inferior. At the start of Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, many German commanders viewed the Soviet Union as an easy target, a colossus with feet of clay that would crumble at the first serious blow. They saw the Red Army as poorly equipped, badly led, and incapable of standing up to the Wehrmacht's superior tactics and technology. This confidence was not entirely baseless. Stalin's purges of the late 1930s had decimated the Soviet officer corps, executing or imprisoning thousands of experienced commanders on spurious charges of treason or political unreliability. The Red Army's poor performance in the Winter War against Finland in 1939 and 1940 had reinforced German confidence that Soviet forces were weak and disorganized. Nazi racial theories painted Slavic peoples as Untermenschen or subhumans, inferior beings who lacked the intelligence and courage to stand against Aryan warriors. This view led many German officers to believe that Soviet soldiers would simply crumble in the face of German strength, that entire armies would surrender after a few defeats, that the Soviet state would collapse just as Tsarist Russia had collapsed in World War I. Hitler himself declared that Germany needed only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure would come tumbling down. This wasn't just propaganda for public consumption. Many German generals genuinely believed it, at least in the early months of the war. However, as the conflict unfolded and the Soviet military demonstrated resilience and strategic ingenuity that shocked their German opponents, this view shifted dramatically. The German perspective on Soviet forces evolved from outright dismissal to genuine fear as the war progressed, and German soldiers encountered an enemy who refused to behave according to their expectations. German forces encountered unexpectedly fierce resistance from the very beginning of Operation Barbarossa. The Red Army may have been caught off guard initially by the German invasion, with many units destroyed before they could properly mobilize, but they quickly proved their resilience and determination. Soviet soldiers fought with a ferocity that surprised Germans who had expected quick collapse. Individual strongpoints held out for days or weeks after being bypassed, tying down German troops who were needed for the main advance. Soviet counterattacks, though often tactically clumsy and costly, demonstrated that the Red Army was far from defeated. This defense forced German commanders to reassess their views, though the process was gradual and uneven. Some continued to attribute Soviet resistance to political commissars who shot anyone who retreated rather than to genuine fighting spirit. Others began to recognize that they were facing determined opponents who were learning quickly from their early defeats. Field Marshal Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist, reflecting on this shift in perception years after the war, stated with evident respect, "From the very beginning, the Russians proved themselves first-class warriors. Our successes in the first months of the war can be explained by better training. Having gained combat experience, the Russians became first-class soldiers, and they fought with exceptional perseverance and had astounding endurance." This was remarkable testimony from a commander who had led German panzer armies to some of their greatest victories in France and the early months of Barbarossa. This grudging respect for Soviet fighting spirit grew as the war dragged on, and German soldiers realized they were in a life-or-death struggle with an opponent who would never quit. The Battle of Stalingrad, which raged from August 1942 to February 1943, marked a turning point not just in the course of the war, but in German perceptions of their enemy. The Red Army's ability to encircle and destroy an entire German army, the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus, shattered any remaining illusions of Soviet inferiority. German commanders realized that they were facing an opponent capable of conducting complex operational maneuvers, not just throwing masses of men at German positions. The Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad, Operation Uranus, demonstrated sophisticated planning and coordination between multiple fronts, something that German generals had thought the Soviets incapable of achieving. As Soviet counteroffensives gained momentum throughout 1943 and 1944, German commanders found themselves facing an opponent that was not only numerous, but also increasingly skilled and well-equipped. The Red Army of late 1943 bore little resemblance to the force that had been mauled in 1941. Soviet tactics had evolved, incorporating lessons learned at terrible cost. Soviet commanders like Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky proved themselves masters of operational art, capable of conducting battles of encirclement that rivaled anything in German military history. The fear that began to grip German forces was palpable and affected everything from tactical decisions to strategic planning. They realized they were no longer facing an inferior enemy, but a juggernaut that was growing stronger with each passing day, while Germany's own strength was being steadily ground away. Franz Halder, a German general and the chief of the staff of the Army High Command from 1938 until September 1942, captured this evolving recognition in his diary entries. He said about the Soviet army during the early months of the war, "It seems the enemy, on the initiative of the new command, and also, perhaps under the influence of England, makes every effort to hold the front line and not allow us to move further east. Russian troops are fighting, as before, with the greatest tenacity and severity." Halder's use of "as before" is telling. Even in the early months when German forces were advancing rapidly, Soviet resistance was tenacious enough to impress the German High Command. Halder, who had helped plan Operation Barbarossa and believed in its success, found himself forced to acknowledge that the enemy was far more formidable than anticipated. This evolution in German thinking had profound strategic implications that affected every level of military planning. The confidence that had characterized the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, when German soldiers joked about being home for Christmas and officers discussed occupation policies for a conquered Russia, gave way to a more cautious approach based on respect for Soviet capabilities. German commanders now had to contend with an enemy they genuinely feared, one capable of matching and even surpassing their own military strength in both numbers and, increasingly, in tactical sophistication. Defensive planning became more important as German generals realized they could no longer count on defeating Soviet offensives through maneuver alone. It's worth noting that this shift in perception wasn't universal or immediate across the German officer corps. Some German officers clung to their ideological biases longer than others, continuing to attribute Soviet victories to material superiority or political coercion rather than military skill. Hitler himself never fully abandoned his racial theories and continued to insist that Germans were superior to Slavs, even as Soviet armies drove toward Berlin. However, by the time Soviet forces were driving towards Berlin in 1945, even the most ardent believers in Nazi racial theories had to confront the reality of Soviet military power. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The Red Army had defeated the Wehrmacht, something that would have seemed impossible in June 1941. German assessments of specific Soviet commanders also evolved over time. Initially, German intelligence had little information about Soviet command structure beyond the highest levels. As the war progressed, they began to identify and track individual Soviet commanders, assessing their strengths and weaknesses. Georgy Zhukov emerged as a figure of particular concern. German intelligence noted his role in stopping the German advance at Moscow in December 1941, his command of the defense of Stalingrad, and his orchestration of major offensives throughout 1943 and 1944. Some German generals compared him to the great Russian commanders of history like Kutuzov and Suvorov, acknowledging that they were facing a military genius. Other Soviet commanders earned similar respect. Konstantin Rokossovsky, who commanded forces in the encirclement at Stalingrad and later led the liberation of Belarus, was noted for his methodical planning and tactical skill. Ivan Konev, whose forces raced Zhukov to Berlin, was recognized as an aggressive commander who used armor effectively. German generals developed detailed profiles of these and other Soviet commanders, trying to understand their methods and predict their actions. This was a far cry from the early days of Barbarossa, when German intelligence had dismissed Soviet leadership as incompetent. The transformation in German views on Soviet forces also reflected changes in Soviet equipment and organization. Early in the war, German soldiers had often encountered Soviet tanks that were superior to their own, particularly the T-34 medium tank and the KV heavy tank. But these advantages were negated by poor Soviet tactics and communications. By late 1943, the Soviets had not only maintained their edge in tank quality, but had also learned how to use armor effectively in combined arms operations. German tank commanders who had once felt confident of defeating numerically superior Soviet forces now faced opponents who were better trained, better organized, and often better equipped. Soviet artillery also earned German respect as the war progressed. The Red Army's use of massed artillery, often including hundreds of guns firing coordinated barrages, created a level of destruction that German defensive positions could not withstand. German soldiers began to speak of Soviet artillery bombardments with the same dread that Allied soldiers felt for German Navalwerfer rocket launchers. The sophistication of Soviet fire support, coordinating artillery with infantry and armor attacks, demonstrated a level of technical and tactical competence that Germans had not expected from an army they had once dismissed as primitive. Perhaps most disturbing to German commanders was the Red Army's ability to learn and adapt. After suffering catastrophic defeats in 1941 and 1942, Soviet forces had studied German tactics and developed effective countermeasures. They learned to defend in depth rather than concentrating forces at the front line where they could be encircled. They developed techniques for detecting and disrupting German armoured concentrations before attacks could begin. They mastered the art of the breakthrough battle, concentrating overwhelming force at a single point to rupture German lines and then exploiting the breakthrough with mobile forces. In many ways, the Soviets had learned to fight like Germans, adopting the very tactics that had defeated them and applying them with massive resources and utter ruthlessness. The psychological impact of fighting on the Eastern Front also influenced German perceptions. The war in the East was more brutal and unforgiving than fighting in North Africa or Italy. Both sides fought with a savagery that shocked even hardened veterans. German soldiers came to fear Soviet troops not just as military opponents, but as avengers who would show no mercy to the forces that had devastated their homeland. This fear was not entirely irrational. Soviet treatment of German prisoners, especially in the early years of the war, was often harsh, reflecting the brutality with which German forces had treated Soviet civilians and prisoners. German commanders knew that their soldiers fought more desperately on the Eastern Front because surrender might mean death or years in Soviet labor camps. The German assessment of American commanders and forces presented yet another set of contradictions and evolving opinions. Unlike the British, whom Germans saw through the lens of historical military rivalry, or the Soviets, whom they initially dismissed due to ideological prejudice, Americans were something of an unknown quantity at the start of the war. Many German generals had little knowledge of American military history beyond vague awareness of the Civil War and American participation in World War I. They were uncertain what to expect when American forces entered combat in North Africa in late 1942. Initial German encounters with American forces seemed to confirm stereotypes about American military inexperience. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, where German forces under Rommel inflicted a sharp defeat on Green American troops, reinforced German confidence that Americans were brave but poorly trained and led. German commanders noted that American soldiers had good equipment and high morale, but lacked the tactical sophistication that came from experience. Reports from the Kasserine Pass described American units breaking under armored attack, commanders losing control of their forces, and general confusion in the American command structure. However, this initial impression changed rapidly as American forces gained experience and as German commanders encountered the full weight of American military might. What impressed German generals most about the Americans was not individual tactical skill, but the systematic way the US military learned from its mistakes and applied industrial-scale resources to warfare. After Kasserine Pass, American forces reorganized, retrained, and came back stronger. German commanders, who had expected Americans to be demoralized by their initial defeat, found instead that the Americans treated failure as a learning experience and adapted accordingly. Dwight David Eisenhower, born on October 14, 1890, presented German generals with a puzzle. He had never commanded troops in combat before World War II, yet he was placed in charge of increasingly large Allied forces, ultimately commanding all Allied forces in Northwest Europe. Many German generals struggled to understand Eisenhower's role. They knew he was supreme commander, but questioned whether he was actually making operational decisions or simply coordinating between the British and Americans. Some dismissed him as a political general, chosen for his diplomatic skills rather than military acumen. Others recognized that managing the Allied coalition was itself a remarkable achievement requiring political and military talents that few possessed. German intelligence assessments of Eisenhower focused on his decision-making patterns and command style. They noted that he preferred broad-front strategies rather than concentrating force for decisive strikes, an approach that German generals found wasteful and slow, but ultimately effective given Allied material superiority. They observed that Eisenhower was willing to accept slow progress in exchange for minimizing risks, a fundamentally un-German approach that frustrated commanders who had been trained to seek decisive battles. Some German officers suggested that Eisenhower's caution actually worked in Germany's favor by prolonging the war, though this ignored the steady attrition of German forces that broad-front advances produced. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded German forces in the West for much of the war, had a particularly dismissive view of Eisenhower's abilities. Von Rundstedt saw Eisenhower as an administrator rather than a field commander, someone who coordinated logistics and maintained Allied unity, but left actual fighting to subordinates like Patton, Montgomery, and Bradley. Whether this assessment was fair is debatable. Eisenhower made crucial decisions about strategy and resource allocation that shaped the entire campaign in Northwest Europe, but he did so in ways that emphasized consensus and coordination, rather than the bold, personal command style that German generals admired. In the German military tradition, a great general led from the front and imposed his will on the battlefield. Eisenhower led from headquarters and built consensus among strong-willed subordinates, a very different model of command that German generals found difficult to respect. However, some German commanders recognized that Eisenhower's approach was well suited to coalition warfare, and that his ability to keep the Allies working together was itself a significant military achievement. They noted that the Western alliance never suffered the kind of command crises that plagued the Axis, where Hitler's interference and Italian military weakness created constant problems. The fact that American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces could operate under a unified command structure, sharing resources and coordinating operations, was itself a remarkable feat that German generals, for all their tactical skill, had failed to match in their own alliance with Italy and the various satellite states. What German generals could not dismiss was the sheer scale of American military power that Eisenhower directed. The industrial capacity of the United States, its ability to produce endless streams of tanks, trucks, aircraft, and ammunition, overwhelmed German forces regardless of tactical skill. German commanders on the Western Front after D-Day reported being constantly attacked by Allied aircraft, running short of fuel and ammunition, while their enemies had unlimited supplies and facing fresh American divisions when their own units were ground down to remnants. This material disparity shaped every aspect of the fighting in Western Europe and ultimately made German tactical victories irrelevant when Americans could simply absorb losses and return stronger than before. The German assessment of individual American commanders below Eisenhower varied. Omar Bradley, who commanded American ground forces in Northwest Europe, was seen as competent and methodical, but uninspiring. A general who got results through careful planning rather than tactical brilliance. Some German generals compared him favorably to Montgomery, noting that Bradley seemed more flexible and willing to adjust plans based on battlefield conditions. Others saw him as simply another example of Allied commanders who won through material superiority rather than skill. Courtney Hodges, who commanded the 1st US Army, received little attention from German intelligence compared to Patton or Bradley. German assessments of Hodges were generally neutral, describing him as a solid professional who executed orders effectively but showed little individual flair. This may have been unfair to Hodges, who conducted successful operations throughout the campaign in Northwest Europe, but German generals tended to focus on commanders whose style they found interesting or threatening. Hodges' methodical approach attracted less attention than Patton's flamboyance. Jacob Devers, who commanded the 6th Army Group in southern France and Alsace, was similarly underappreciated by German intelligence. German commanders who faced Devers' forces recognized that they were dealing with competent opponents, but saw the battles in southern France as secondary to the main fighting further north. This was partly accurate, as the pursuit up the Rhone Valley faced lighter German resistance than the fighting in Normandy and the Low Countries, but it also reflected German tendency to dismiss operations that didn't fit their preferred model of decisive mobile warfare. American tactical doctrine also received mixed reviews from German observers. German commanders noted that Americans relied heavily on artillery and air support to compensate for what Germans saw as tactical inflexibility at the small unit level. American infantry attacks typically followed a pattern: heavy preparatory bombardment, advance to objectives, consolidate, repeat. This was effective but unimaginative in German eyes, lacking the fluidity and initiative that German doctrine encouraged at all levels. However, German generals also acknowledged that American artillery was devastatingly effective and that American forward observers could call in supporting fire with remarkable speed and accuracy. An American infantry company might lack the tactical sophistication of a German equivalent, but it had vastly superior fire support that more than compensated. American armored doctrine was another area where German assessments evolved. Initially, American tank units seemed to repeat British mistakes from earlier in the war, scattering armour in small packets across the front, rather than concentrating it for decisive blows. However, as the war progressed, American armoured divisions learned to operate in larger formations and to coordinate better with infantry and artillery. The development of combined arms task forces, mixing tanks, infantry and artillery in flexible groups, impressed German commanders who recognized their own combined arms principles being applied by the Americans. By late 1944, German intelligence reports noted that American armored divisions were operating with a sophistication that matched German panzer divisions, though still with the advantage of overwhelming air and artillery support that German forces could no longer match. The quality of American equipment also earned German respect. German soldiers captured American tanks, trucks, and weapons and found them well designed and reliable. The Sherman tank, though inferior in armor and firepower to later German tanks like the Panther and Tiger, was recognized as a rugged and dependable vehicle that could be produced in vast numbers. German mechanics noted that American vehicles were designed for ease of maintenance and repair, with standardized parts and simple systems that allowed rapid battlefield repairs. This contrasted with German equipment, which was often over-engineered and difficult to maintain in field conditions. Some German officers admitted that they would have gladly traded their sophisticated but unreliable equipment for American simplicity and abundance. American logistics particularly impressed German observers. The ability of American forces to maintain supply lines across thousands of miles, to keep divisions fed and fueled even during rapid advances, demonstrated organizational capabilities that Germans could only envy by late in the war. German armies in 1944 and 1945 were constantly short of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, even when fighting on German soil with theoretically short supply lines. American armies, fighting far from home across an ocean, somehow never seemed to run out of anything. German intelligence officers studying American logistics were awed by the scale and efficiency of the system, which moved mountains of supplies with mechanical precision. The racial integration issues in the American military attracted some attention from German intelligence, though their understanding was filtered through Nazi racial ideology and was therefore deeply flawed. German propaganda attempted to exploit racial tensions in America, broadcasting messages suggesting that African American soldiers were being used as cannon fodder by white officers. However, German soldiers who actually fought against African American units, such as the 92nd Infantry Division in Italy or the 761st Tank Battalion in France, generally described them as brave and effective soldiers. Some German prisoners expressed surprise at this, revealing their own racist assumptions, while others simply accepted that they were facing determined opponents, regardless of race. The German view of American commanders and forces ultimately came down to a recognition that Americans compensated for initial inexperience and tactical rigidity with massive resources, rapid learning, and systematic application of firepower. German generals respected American professionalism and industrial might while maintaining that German tactical skill was superior. This allowed them to preserve their professional pride, even as American forces drove deeper into Germany. They could tell themselves that they were being defeated by numbers rather than superior generalship, a comforting fiction that ignored the very real improvements in American tactical performance and the strategic skill required to mobilize and direct such massive military power. What emerges from examining German views of all the Allied commanders is a portrait of professional soldiers trying to understand and defeat enemies who approached warfare differently than they did. The Germans valued tactical brilliance, rapid maneuver, and decisive battles. They found it difficult to appreciate commanders like Eisenhower, who won through coalition management, or Montgomery, who won through methodical preparation. They understood and respected Patton because he fought the way they did, but they struggled to see the strategic wisdom in Allied approaches that prioritized steady pressure and material superiority over brilliant tactical strokes. In the end, the Allied way of war proved more effective than the German way, but German generals never fully accepted this reality. They preferred to believe that they had been overwhelmed by numbers rather than outfought by better strategy, and this belief shaped their post-war writings and memoirs in ways that continue to influence popular understanding of World War II. The complexity of these German assessments becomes even more apparent when we examine how they viewed Allied cooperation and coalition warfare. German commanders were accustomed to operating in a system where Hitler made final decisions and German forces dominated their allies. The Wehrmacht provided equipment, training, and often officers to Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces, treating them more as auxiliaries than equal partners. This experience left German generals unprepared to understand how the Western Allies managed to work together effectively despite having different national interests, military traditions, and command philosophies. The Anglo-American alliance presented German intelligence with a puzzle. British and American forces operated under unified command structures, shared intelligence and resources, and coordinated strategies despite occasional disagreements between commanders. German officers studied this cooperation carefully, looking for weaknesses they could exploit. They noted tensions between Montgomery and American commanders, particularly during the planning for operations like Market Garden and the Bulge offensive. However, these tensions never escalated into the kind of command crises that German intelligence hoped for. Allied commanders might disagree vehemently in private, but they presented a united front to their troops and to the enemy. German assessment of Allied combined arms cooperation was similarly grudging. The Allies had developed systems for coordinating air power, armour, artillery and infantry that were different from German methods but equally effective. American forces in particular excelled at calling in tactical air support, with fighter bombers responding to ground requests within minutes. German commanders who had enjoyed Luftwaffe superiority in the early war years found themselves on the receiving end of devastating air attacks by late 1943. They could see that Allied ground forces fought differently than German forces, precisely because they could rely on overwhelming air support that German forces no longer possessed. The German inability to match Allied air-ground coordination became a source of bitter frustration. German armoured formations that had once swept across battlefields with impunity now had to move at night or in bad weather to avoid Allied fighters. German soldiers learned to dread clear skies, knowing that Allied aircraft would attack any movement they detected. This constant pressure from the air degraded German military effectiveness in ways that went beyond simple casualty counts. It forced German forces to disperse, to move slowly, to hide rather than maneuver, all of which played into Allied strengths and away from German tactical preferences. How did this shape the final year of fighting? German commanders found themselves fighting a fundamentally different war than the one they had trained for and excelled at in the early years. The principles that had brought them victory in Poland, France, and the early months of Barbarossa no longer applied when facing enemies who controlled the skies and possessed unlimited supplies. The German response to Allied strategic bombing revealed another dimension of their assessment of Allied commanders and capabilities. Initially, German military leaders had dismissed strategic bombing as ineffective, pointing to the survival of German industry and the continued functioning of German society despite heavy raids. However, by 1944, the cumulative effect of Allied bombing had become impossible to ignore. German commanders found themselves fighting with inadequate air cover, limited fuel supplies, and disrupted transportation networks, all consequences of the strategic bombing campaign that they had once dismissed as a waste of Allied resources. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded German forces in northern France before D-Day, became acutely aware of how Allied air power had changed the nature of warfare. He inspected the coastal defences and immediately recognised that any German attempt to move reserves to counter an Allied invasion would be devastated by Allied aircraft. His famous statement that the Allies must be defeated on the beaches reflected this understanding. Rommel knew that once Allied forces established themselves ashore with their enormous firepower and air support, German forces would be unable to dislodge them through conventional counterattacks. His attempts to strengthen beach defences and deploy forces close to the coast reflected a realistic appreciation of Allied capabilities that not all German commanders shared. The Battle of Normandy itself became a testament to how German tactical skill could not overcome Allied material and air superiority. German commanders in Normandy fought skillfully, using terrain and fortified positions to maximize the effectiveness of their limited forces. Individual German units, particularly SS Panzer divisions and paratroop formations, demonstrated tactical excellence that impressed even their enemies. However, every German counterattack was broken up by Allied artillery and air power. Every attempt to move reinforcements was delayed by air attacks on roads and railways. Every concentration of German armour was detected and bombed before it could launch attacks. German generals watched their carefully planned operations fall apart under the weight of Allied firepower. What became clear to German commanders during the Normandy campaign was that the Allies had developed a system of warfare that negated traditional German advantages. German soldiers were better trained and more experienced than many of their Allied counterparts. German tanks were more powerful. German tactics were more sophisticated. None of it mattered when Allied forces could call down artillery fire from hundreds of guns or summon fighter bombers to attack any target within minutes. The Germans were fighting industrial-age warfare with methods developed in an earlier era, and the mismatch was devastating. The failed German counteroffensive at Mortain in August 1944 illustrated these problems perfectly. Hitler ordered an attack to cut off American forces that had broken out from Normandy, and German commanders assembled what remained of their armoured strength for the operation. The attack began with some initial success, but within hours Allied aircraft swarmed over the battlefield. German tanks and vehicles were destroyed by the hundreds. The counteroffensive collapsed, and its failure opened the way for Allied forces to encircle much of the German 7th Army in the Falaise pocket. German commanders who survived Falaise described an apocalypse of fire from above, where their tactical skills were useless against enemies they could barely see. Yet even in defeat, German assessment of Allied commanders remained critical. They noted that the Falaise pocket should have been closed days earlier, allowing most of the German forces to escape. They pointed to what they saw as Allied hesitation and poor coordination that gave German troops time to retreat. This criticism had some merit. The gap in the Allied encirclement remained open longer than it should have, and tens of thousands of German soldiers escaped when more aggressive Allied action might have trapped them all. However, German commanders who criticised Allied performance at Falaise often failed to acknowledge that their own forces were utterly destroyed as effective formations despite their escape. The equipment and heavy weapons lost at Falaise could not be replaced. The German perspective on the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945 provides another revealing glimpse into how they viewed Allied commanders. Hitler conceived the offensive as a surprise attack that would split Allied forces, capture Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate. Most German generals thought the plan was wildly optimistic and argued for more limited objectives, but Hitler insisted on the grand vision. When the attack began on December 16, 1944, German forces achieved complete tactical surprise, smashing through American lines in the Ardennes and advancing rapidly toward the Meuse River. German commanders watched closely to see how Allied leaders would respond to this crisis. Would they panic? Would the Anglo-American alliance fracture under pressure? Would British and American forces blame each other for the disaster? Instead, German intelligence observed Eisenhower quickly shifting reserves to contain the German penetration, Montgomery taking command of forces north of the breakthrough, and Patton wheeling his Third Army northward in a remarkable display of operational flexibility. The Allied response was faster and more coordinated than German planners had expected, revealing a level of staff work and command capability that many German generals had not credited to the Allies. The crushing of the Bulge offensive by late January demonstrated conclusively that German forces could no longer win battles through tactical excellence alone. The Germans had achieved surprise, had fought skillfully, had shown that they could still mount major offensive operations. It made no difference. Allied forces had contained the breakthrough, brought up reserves faster than Germans could exploit their initial success, and then ground down the attackers through superior firepower. German losses in men and equipment during the Bulge were irreplaceable, and the offensive had accomplished nothing except to weaken German defences against the final Allied drives into Germany. Interestingly, the Bulge offensive produced a brief spike in German morale and confidence based on their initial successes. German soldiers who had been retreating for months suddenly found themselves advancing again, capturing American supplies and equipment, taking thousands of prisoners. For a brief moment, it seemed like the early days of the war when German arms were everywhere victorious. However, this euphoria quickly faded as reality reasserted itself. The offensive stalled, Allied forces counterattacked, and German units that had advanced in triumph now retreated in disorder. The psychological impact of this failure was devastating for German commanders who had briefly allowed themselves to hope that tactical skill might still overcome Allied material superiority. German assessment of individual Allied commanders during the Bulge varied. They credited Eisenhower with responding quickly and decisively to coordinate the Allied response. Montgomery's controversial role in commanding forces north of the breakthrough drew mixed reactions. Some German commanders saw it as evidence of Anglo-American command tensions, while others recognized it as pragmatic adjustment to battlefield realities. Patton's rapid wheel to the north impressed German commanders who understood how difficult it was to shift an entire army from one axis of advance to another in winter conditions. Despite their general dismissal of Patton as benefiting from American resources, they had to acknowledge that moving Third Army so quickly required skilled staff work and aggressive leadership. The final months of the war, from February to May 1945, saw German commanders fighting desperate defensive battles on both eastern and western fronts. Their assessments of Allied commanders during this period were coloured by the realisation that Germany had lost the war and that their own military careers were ending in catastrophic defeat. Some officers continued to assess Allied performance with professional detachment, noting tactical mistakes and missed opportunities, even as German defences crumbled. Others descended into bitterness, blaming Allied material superiority for German defeat, while maintaining that German soldiers and commanders remained superior in skill and courage. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 struck German commanders as the final blow to their hopes of prolonging the war. The Rhine was Germany's last major defensive barrier in the west, and German forces had demolished bridges and prepared extensive fortifications along the eastern bank. When American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact on March 7th, German commanders realized that the Rhine barrier had been breached before defenses could be fully organized. Hitler's fury at this failure led to the execution of several officers, demonstrating how divorced the Nazi leadership had become from military reality. German commanders at Remagen had fought as hard as possible to destroy the bridge, but American forces had moved too quickly for demolition charges to be properly prepared. Montgomery's carefully planned Rhine crossing at Wesel on March 23rd involved massive preparations and overwhelming force that German defenders could not hope to stop. German commanders watching this operation saw it as characteristic of Montgomery's methods: thorough, methodical, using massive resources to guarantee success. They could criticize the slowness of Montgomery's advance compared to American exploitation of the Remagen bridgehead, but they had to acknowledge that Montgomery's crossing achieved all its objectives with minimal casualties. The contrast between British and American styles remained visible even in the war's final weeks. As Allied armies drove deeper into Germany, German commanders faced choices about how to end their military careers. Some fought to the bitter end, obeying Hitler's orders to defend every inch of German soil, regardless of the cost. Others sought to surrender to Western forces rather than the Soviets, hoping for better treatment as prisoners of war. A few attempted to negotiate local surrenders or arrange for orderly withdrawals that would save German lives. These decisions reflected not just military calculations, but personal judgments about honor, duty, and survival in the face of certain defeat. The German High Command's assessment of Allied intentions during the final weeks of the war showed interesting patterns. German intelligence tried to determine whether Western allies would race the Soviets to Berlin or whether they would halt and allow Soviet forces to capture the German capital. When Eisenhower decided to halt Allied forces along the Elbe River and let Soviet forces take Berlin, some German commanders saw this as a strategic mistake that gave Stalin a propaganda victory. Others recognized it as a realistic assessment that Berlin had no strategic value worth the casualties its capture would cost Western forces. The debate about whether Western forces should have taken Berlin continued among German officers long after the war ended. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, who signed Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, represented the German High Command's final reckoning with Allied victory. Keitel had been loyal to Hitler throughout the war, executing orders without question even when they made no military sense. His signature on surrender documents acknowledged what all German commanders now had to accept, that Allied forces had defeated Germany completely and that German military resistance was over. The ceremony at Karlshorst in Berlin, where Soviet commanders insisted that Germany surrender separately to Soviet forces after the initial surrender at Rennes, demonstrated that the wartime alliance between Western powers and the Soviet Union was already fraying. German officers noted this tension, and some hoped that East-West conflict might somehow save Germany from total occupation, though these hopes proved illusory. The post-war writings and testimonies of German generals provided extensive material for understanding their views on Allied commanders. Many German officers were interrogated by Allied intelligence after capture, providing detailed assessments of what they thought had worked and failed in Allied operations. These interrogations, conducted while memories were fresh and defeat was recent, revealed both genuine professional assessments and self-serving attempts to explain away German failures. Historians must read these sources carefully, understanding that German generals had reasons to emphasize Allied material superiority rather than acknowledge that they had been outgeneraled as well as overwhelmed. The United States Army Historical Division employed captured German generals to write studies of the Eastern Front and other campaigns, producing the Foreign Military Studies series. Generals like Franz Halder, Heinz Guderian, and Erich von Manstein wrote detailed accounts of operations from the German perspective. These accounts influenced post-war understanding of World War II, particularly in the West, where few Soviet sources were available during the Cold War. German generals in these studies tended to emphasize their own competence and the quality of German soldiers, while attributing defeats to Hitler's interference, Soviet numbers, and Allied material superiority. This narrative served German officers well in rehabilitation efforts and influenced popular understanding of the war for decades. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the idea that German military forces fought honorably and were separate from Nazi atrocities, was partly constructed through post-war German accounts emphasizing professional military assessments over ideological commitment. German generals in their memoirs and interviews stressed that they were soldiers following orders, not Nazis implementing genocide. They presented themselves as professionals who respected their Allied counterparts as fellow soldiers. This narrative was convenient for both German officers seeking to rebuild reputations and for Western militaries that needed to understand German tactics and potentially recruit German military expertise for the Cold War. However, it obscured the deep complicity of the Wehrmacht in Nazi crimes and the extent to which German military operations were shaped by Nazi ideology. When examining specific campaigns and battles, German assessments revealed consistent patterns. They praised Allied logistics and firepower while criticizing Allied tactics and operational art. They acknowledged that Allied soldiers became more effective as the war progressed, but maintained that German soldiers remained superior when comparing units of similar experience. They recognized that Allied commanders improved throughout the war, but suggested that German commanders would have achieved more with similar resources. These assessments contained the elements of truth mixed with self-justification, making them valuable but problematic sources for understanding the war. The German view of Allied naval commanders received less attention in post-war accounts because the Wehrmacht's focus was primarily on ground operations. However, German naval officers who had fought in the Battle of the Atlantic or opposed Allied amphibious operations had their own assessments. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who commanded German U-boat forces and briefly succeeded Hitler as head of state, respected Allied anti-submarine capabilities while maintaining that German submarines could have won if given proper support. He acknowledged that Allied technology, particularly radar and sonar, had neutralized German submarine advantages by mid-1943. However, he argued that with more submarines and better air cover, the U-boat campaign might have succeeded in cutting Britain's Atlantic lifeline. German admirals who faced Allied naval forces in major operations generally acknowledged Allied superiority in surface warfare. The Royal Navy's aggressive pursuit of German surface raiders and the successful destruction of vessels like the Bismarck demonstrated British naval competence that German commanders could not dismiss. However, German naval officers also noted missed opportunities where Allied caution allowed German ships to escape destruction. The Channel dash of February 1942, when Scharnhorst, Gneisenau and Prinz Eugen sailed through the English Channel under British noses, was cited by German admirals as an example of Allied unpreparedness despite their material superiority. The German assessment of Allied conduct during occupation revealed final thoughts on their former enemies. German civilians and soldiers who survived the war encountered Allied occupation forces and formed opinions about how they were treated. Generally, Germans found Western Allied occupation forces to be fair and professional, maintaining order while avoiding the brutality that characterized Soviet occupation. German military officers who became prisoners of war in Western camps reported being treated according to Geneva Conventions, though conditions varied and some camps were harsh. This treatment influenced post-war German views of Western Allied commanders, suggesting that professional military standards had been maintained even in victory. The contrast between Soviet and Western Allied occupation policies shaped German perspectives for generations. German generals who had fought on both fronts noted that Western allies generally distinguished between Nazi leadership and ordinary Germans, while Soviet forces treated all Germans as collectively responsible for Nazi crimes. This distinction influenced how German military history was written after the war, with German generals more willing to cooperate with Western historians and acknowledge Western Allied military competence. The political context of the Cold War reinforced these patterns, as both West Germany and Western allies found it useful to emphasize shared values and mutual respect between former enemies. An interesting dimension of German assessment concerned the role of intelligence in Allied success. German commanders recognized that Allied code breaking, particularly the breaking of German enigma codes, had given the Allies enormous advantages throughout the war. However, the full extent of Allied signals intelligence remained classified for decades after the war, so German generals writing in the 1950s and 60s attributed Allied successes to other factors. They noted that Allies seemed to anticipate German moves with suspicious accuracy, but generally attributed this to aerial reconnaissance and spy networks rather than code breaking. When ultra-intelligence was declassified in the 1970s, many German generals expressed shock at how thoroughly their communications had been compromised. This revelation forced reassessment of many battles where German commanders had thought they enjoyed surprise or where they blamed German failures on bad luck rather than enemy foreknowledge. The question of whether better Allied generalship could have shortened the war became a topic of debate among German military historians. Some argued that more aggressive Allied strategies, particularly in late 1944, might have ended the war months earlier. They pointed to what they saw as missed opportunities. The failure to close the Falaise Gap quickly, the failure to capitalize on initial successes in Market Garden, the cautious advance through the Siegfried Line. However, these arguments typically ignored the very real challenges Allied commanders faced in maintaining supply lines, coordinating multinational forces, and balancing military objectives with political considerations. German generals who made these arguments were essentially claiming that they would have defeated themselves more quickly if they had been in command of Allied forces, a paradoxical position that revealed the limits of their understanding. The development of post-war German military thinking was influenced by assessments of Allied operations. When West Germany established the Bundeswehr in the 1950s, German military planners studied both Allied and German operations from World War II to develop doctrine for the new army. They recognized that modern warfare required the kind of logistical excellence and combined arms integration that Allies had demonstrated. However, they also sought to preserve German traditions of initiative and flexibility at lower command levels. The resulting German military doctrine blended German Auftragstactic with American-style emphasis on firepower and logistics, creating a hybrid that reflected lessons learned from fighting against Western allies. Individual German generals varied considerably in how their views evolved after the war. Some became bitter and resentful, blaming Allied victory on material superiority while denying that Allies had outfought them. Others developed more nuanced views, acknowledging that Allied commanders had learned and adapted throughout the war, and that Allied ways of war were different from but not inferior to German methods. A few German generals, particularly those who spent years in Soviet captivity, came to question whether any military victory was worth the catastrophic losses Germany had suffered. These varying perspectives influenced how different generations of Germans understood the war and their nation's military history. The personal relationships that developed between captured German generals and their Allied captors sometimes influenced post-war assessments. German generals who were treated with respect by their captors often spoke more favorably about Allied military competence than those who experienced harsh treatment. These personal factors added another layer of complexity to German assessments, reminding us that military history is written by human beings whose judgments are influenced by personal experiences and emotions as well as professional analysis. The Cold War context fundamentally shaped how German assessments of Allied commanders were received and interpreted. Western militaries were eager to learn from German tactical expertise and therefore encouraged German generals to share their knowledge. This created an environment where German assessments were taken seriously and German military competence was emphasized, sometimes at the expense of acknowledging German defeats and failures. Soviet assessments of the war, which emphasized Soviet military achievements and minimized Western Allied contributions, created a counter-narrative that also influenced how German assessments were used. German generals found themselves in the middle of Cold War historiographical battles, with both sides citing German sources to support their arguments about who had really won the war. The evolution of military technology after World War II influenced how German generals assessed Allied commanders retrospectively. As nuclear weapons, missiles, and jet aircraft transformed warfare, some German generals argued that the kind of tactical excellence Germany had demonstrated in World War II was now obsolete. They suggested that future wars would be decided by technology and industrial capacity rather than traditional military virtues. This perspective allowed them to acknowledge Allied victory in World War II, while maintaining that German tactical methods had been superior within their historical context. It was a way of preserving professional pride while accepting the reality of defeat. The memoirs published by German generals in the decades after the war became bestsellers in many countries, shaping public understanding of military operations. Heinz Guderian's Panzerlieder, Erich von Manstein's Lost Victories, and other works presented German perspectives on the war that emphasized tactical brilliance and argued that Germany could have won if not for Hitler's interference. These books contained assessments of Allied commanders that were widely read and influential. They portrayed Patton as the most formidable Allied general, Montgomery as overly cautious, Eisenhower as a politician rather than a soldier, and Soviet commanders as beneficiaries of numerical superiority. These characterizations became part of popular understanding of World War II and influenced how subsequent generations understood the conflict. However, as archives opened and more sources became available, historians began to question German assessments and the self-serving narratives many German generals had constructed. Research revealed that German military operations were often less skillful than portrayed, that Hitler's strategic decisions were sometimes more sound than his generals acknowledged, and that Allied commanders were more competent than German sources suggested. The opening of Soviet archives after the Cold War particularly challenged German assessments of the Eastern Front, revealing that Soviet commanders had been more sophisticated and German operations less successful than Wehrmacht veterans had claimed. This revision of military history continues today as scholars balance German assessments against evidence from Allied sources and modern analysis. The question of how accurately German generals assessed Allied commanders remains complex. They were professional soldiers observing their enemies in combat. so their assessments contained valuable insights about Allied strengths and weaknesses. However, they were also participants in a catastrophic war who needed to explain their own defeat, so their assessments were coloured by self-justification and ideological bias. The most useful German assessments acknowledge both Allied competence and German failures, while avoiding the extremes of either dismissing Allied victories as purely due to material superiority or denying German responsibility for the war's outcome. Modern historians use German assessments as one source among many, valuable for understanding how Germans perceive their enemies but requiring corroboration and critical analysis. The German generals' assessments ultimately reveal as much about German military culture as they do about Allied commanders. The emphasis on tactical brilliance, aggressive maneuver, and decisive battle reflected German military values that had developed over centuries. The difficulty in appreciating different approaches to warfare, whether Montgomery's methodical preparation or Eisenhower's coalition management, showed the limits of German military thinking. The tendency to attribute German defeat to material factors rather than strategic mistakes revealed an inability to fully acknowledge that German strategy had failed at the deepest levels. These patterns in German assessment help us understand not just World War II, but the nature of military professionalism and how soldiers make sense of victory and defeat. Looking at these assessments across the entire war, certain themes emerge repeatedly. German commanders consistently praised aggressive action, whether by Patton driving across France or Soviet forces launching massive offensives. They understood and respected commanders who thought in terms of maneuver and encirclement, because these were the concepts that dominated German military education. Commanders who fought differently, emphasizing firepower over maneuver or political considerations over purely military objectives, received less respect even when their methods proved effective. This reveals a certain rigidity in German military thinking, an inability to fully appreciate that their opponents had developed new ways of war that were adapted to modern industrial conditions and democratic political systems. The legacy of these German assessments continues to influence military education and popular understanding of World War II today. Military academies around the world still study German operational art while also examining how Allied forces defeated it. The complex relationship between tactical excellence and strategic success, between individual brilliance and systematic organization, between aggressive risk-taking and careful preparation, these themes from World War II remain relevant to military professionals today. Understanding how German generals viewed their Allied opponents helps us understand these enduring questions about the nature of military effectiveness and how wars are won and lost. The assessments were often wrong in detail, but revealed truths about military culture and the challenge of adapting to new forms of warfare. As we move into examining the final phase of these relationships and their lasting impact, we see how professional military assessments became intertwined with politics, memory, and the search for lessons that might prevent future catastrophes. Contrary to what might be assumed, the German viewpoints on Allied forces have not faded post-war, but instead continue to influence present-day military strategy and our understanding of warfare itself. The insights collected from German generals regarding their adversaries provide critical lessons that remain relevant today, though we must approach them with appropriate skepticism and awareness of their biases. For instance, the admiration for British resilience has led many modern armies to prioritize troop morale and endurance in training and doctrine. The understanding that even the best soldiers cannot prevail if their commanders are overly cautious has influenced military education's emphasis on aggressive leadership and seizing initiative. Similarly, the concerns about Soviet numerical strength drove NATO to invest heavily in technological advancements during the Cold War, seeking qualitative advantages to offset quantitative disadvantages. The effectiveness of Patton's bold tactics has left a lasting mark on mechanized warfare doctrine, with armor schools around the world teaching aggressive exploitation of breakthroughs. The American emphasis on logistics and firepower, which German generals initially dismissed as compensation for tactical weakness, has become the foundation of modern military operations. Every professional military now understands that tactical brilliance means little without the ability to sustain forces in combat. The integration of air power with ground operations, which German forces pioneered but Allied forces perfected, remains central to military doctrine. The lessons German generals learned about the importance of air superiority, often learned painfully as Allied aircraft dominated the skies, influenced post-war military development in every major nation. No modern military would contemplate major operations without air superiority, a lesson that cost Germany dearly to learn. The study of German assessments also revealed important lessons about military innovation and adaptation. German forces entered the war with tactical and operational advantages that reflected years of careful development and training. However, they failed to maintain these advantages as the war progressed. Allied forces, starting from positions of relative weakness, learned and adapted more quickly than German forces did. This suggests that the ability to learn from failure and systematically apply lessons learned may be more important than initial tactical superiority. Modern militaries emphasize continuous learning and adaptation precisely because World War II demonstrated that initial advantages can be overcome by enemies who learn faster. The German experience also highlighted the dangers of ideological blindness in military assessment. Nazi racial theories led German commanders to underestimate Soviet forces catastrophically, costing Germany hundreds of thousands of lives, and ultimately the war in the East. The initial dismissal of American military capabilities, based partly on stereotypes about American softness and inexperience, led to strategic miscalculations that allowed the United States time to mobilize its vast resources. Modern military intelligence organizations emphasize objective assessment of enemy capabilities precisely to avoid the kind of ideological distortions that plagued German military intelligence. However, the challenge of seeing enemies clearly rather than through the lens of cultural stereotypes remains relevant today. The role of technology in warfare, evident throughout German assessments of Allied forces, has only grown more important in subsequent decades. German commanders recognized that Allied technological advantages in radar, code breaking, and industrial production had decisive impacts on operations. They noted the effectiveness of Allied artillery, the sophistication of Allied logistics, and the overwhelming power of Allied air forces. These technological factors, initially dismissed by some German commanders as mere material superiority that didn't reflect true military skill, proved decisive in the end. Modern military forces understand that technological innovation must be continuous, and that no amount of tactical skill can fully compensate for technological disadvantage in key areas. The question of coalition warfare, which German commanders struggled to execute effectively, has become even more relevant in the modern era. NATO operations, United Nations peacekeeping missions, and various coalition operations have demonstrated both the challenges and possibilities of multinational military cooperation. German generals who dismissed Allied coalition management as political compromise rather than military leadership failed to appreciate that maintaining alliance cohesion while conducting military operations is itself a crucial military skill. Modern doctrine emphasizes coalition operations and trains officers to work effectively with foreign militaries, recognizing that future conflicts will likely involve coalitions rather than purely national forces. The personal relationships between military leaders, evident in German assessments that distinguished between commanders they respected and those they dismissed, remain important in modern military operations. The professional courtesy that sometimes existed between German and Western Allied officers, even while they were trying to kill each other, suggests that military professionalism can transcend temporary enmities. Modern military education emphasizes professional ethics and the laws of war, partly to maintain this professional culture. However, the breakdown of professional norms on the Eastern Front, where both German and Soviet forces committed massive atrocities, demonstrates that professional military culture alone cannot prevent barbarism when political leadership demands it. The German generals' tendency to blame Hitler for strategic failures while taking credit for tactical successes reveals enduring patterns in how military organizations deal with defeat. Modern militaries recognize that strategic direction must come from political leadership, but that military professionals have responsibility for providing honest assessments and speaking truth to power. The failure of German generals to effectively resist Hitler's worst strategic decisions, whether from conviction, careerism, or fear, remains a cautionary tale about civil-military relations. Democratic militaries emphasize civilian control precisely to avoid the kind of military-political fusion that characterized Nazi Germany. while also recognizing that military leaders must be willing to resign rather than implement orders they consider militarily or morally wrong. The evolution of German assessments from confidence to desperation as the war progressed offers lessons about military morale and the psychology of defeat. Early German confidence, based on real tactical superiority and early victories, gradually eroded as losses mounted and Allied forces improved. German commanders watched their advantages disappear one by one. Air superiority lost, naval dominance gone, numerical superiority reversed, technological advantages eliminated, fuel and ammunition shortages crippling operations. This experience of gradual degradation influenced post-war German military thinking, which emphasized the importance of maintaining combat power and avoiding attritional warfare that favors enemies with greater resources. The specific tactical assessments German generals made about Allied commanders contain lessons that remain relevant. Their recognition that Patton excelled at exploitation but was less skilled at set-piece battles suggests that different commanders have different strengths that should be matched to appropriate situations. Their observation that Montgomery was meticulous in preparation but slow in execution highlights the trade-offs between thoroughness and speed. Their grudging respect for Soviet operational skill, despite ideological contempt, demonstrates that professional military assessment must override political prejudice if it is to be accurate. These nuanced judgments, when stripped of self-serving bias, provide insights into command that military educators still find valuable. The German assessment of American forces' learning curve particularly influenced post-war military education. The transformation of American forces from the confused units at Kasserine Pass to the confident armies driving into Germany demonstrated that systematic training and doctrine development could produce highly effective forces even from relatively inexperienced personnel. This influenced American military education after the war, with emphasis on training systems and professional military education that could rapidly develop competent officers and soldiers. The German observation that Americans learn from their mistakes faster than Germans adapted their methods influenced modern American military culture's emphasis on after-action reviews and continuous improvement. The Cold War context gave German military assessments of Soviet forces particular relevance. Western militaries studying how to defend Western Europe against potential Soviet attack interviewed German generals extensively about Soviet military capabilities and methods. These assessments, filtered through German experience on the Eastern Front, influenced NATO's strategy and tactics throughout the Cold War. However, the limitations of German assessments, particularly their tendency to underestimate Soviet sophistication and to attribute Soviet victories to numerical superiority, may have distorted Western understanding of Soviet military capabilities. Modern historians recognizing these biases have worked to develop more balanced assessments of Soviet military performance. The impact of German assessments on popular culture and public understanding of World War II cannot be overstated. Books by German generals, films featuring German perspectives, and popular histories drawing on German sources have shaped how millions of people understand the war. The image of the brilliant German tactical commander defeated only by overwhelming Allied resources owes much to German post-war writings. This narrative, while containing elements of truth, obscures the extent to which German strategy was fundamentally flawed, and German military performance was uneven. Modern historians work to counter these narratives by providing more balanced assessments drawing on sources from all sides, but German perspectives remain influential in popular understanding. The ethical dimensions of studying German assessments require careful consideration. These were assessments made by officers serving a genocidal regime, many of whom were complicit in war crimes and crimes against humanity. Their professional military judgments cannot be entirely separated from the moral context in which they operated. Modern military education struggles with how to use German sources while acknowledging the Nazi context and avoiding rehabilitation of officers who bear responsibility for terrible crimes. The tendency to focus on tactical and operational lessons while ignoring the moral failures of the German military has been criticized as perpetuating myths about the clean Wehrmacht. The comparison between German assessments of different Allied forces reveals interesting patterns about military culture and perception. German generals understood and respected British forces, partly because they shared cultural and class backgrounds with British officers. They found Americans puzzling because American military culture was more egalitarian and less steeped in traditional military values. They feared Soviets partly because Soviet forces represented everything Nazi ideology claimed to oppose: a multi-ethnic army fighting for a communist state. These cultural factors influenced military assessments in ways that went beyond objective evaluation of combat effectiveness. The geographic differences in how German generals assessed Allied forces also merit attention. In North Africa, where both British and German forces fought far from home with limited resources, German assessments focused on tactical competence and desert warfare skills. In Italy, where terrain favoured defenders, German assessments emphasised Allied firepower and methodical approach. In Northwest Europe, where Allied resources were overwhelming, German assessments focused on material superiority and air power. On the Eastern Front, where the scale of operations dwarfed anything in the West, German assessments emphasised Soviet numbers and resilience. These geographic contexts shaped assessments in ways that make it difficult to generalise about German views. The timing of German assessments also mattered significantly. Early war assessments, made when German forces were victorious and confident, differed substantially from late war assessments made in the context of defeat and desperation. German generals captured in 1943 had different perspectives than those captured in 1945. Assessments made immediately after battles differed from those made years later in memoirs when memories had faded and self-justification had become more important. Historians must consider these temporal factors when evaluating German sources. The influence of individual German generals' personalities and experiences on their assessments deserves recognition. Rommel's assessments reflected his experience in mobile warfare and his respect for aggressive action. Guderian's assessments emphasized armored operations and the importance of combined arms. Manstein's assessments reflected his focus on operational art and large-scale maneuver. Kesselring's assessments were shaped by his experience in defensive warfare and his relatively optimistic personality. These individual variations remind us that German assessments were not monolithic, but reflected diverse experiences and perspectives within the German officer corps. The role of German intelligence failures in shaping assessments cannot be ignored. German intelligence consistently underestimated Allied production capacity, failed to predict Allied strategies, and misread Allied intentions. These intelligence failures led to operational assessments that were based on incomplete or incorrect information. German generals sometimes praised or criticized Allied commanders based on faulty understanding of what actually happened or why decisions were made. Modern intelligence organizations study these German intelligence failures to understand how biases and assumptions can distort assessment of enemy capabilities. The interaction between German tactical assessments and strategic reality created paradoxes that German generals struggled to resolve. They could win tactical victories repeatedly and still lose the war. They could demonstrate superior small unit tactics and still be driven back by enemies they had defeated on the battlefield. They could admire Allied commanders for specific qualities while viewing Allied strategy as fundamentally flawed. These paradoxes reflected the reality that tactical excellence is necessary but not sufficient for victory in modern war, a lesson that remains relevant for military professionals today. The German experience of fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously influenced their assessments of different Allied forces. Commanders who served primarily in the East had different perspectives than those who fought primarily in the West. Officers who experienced both fronts could compare and contrast their opponents, often concluding that Soviet forces were more dangerous in their relentless pressure, while Western Allied forces were more dangerous in their ability to coordinate complex operations with massive firepower. These comparative assessments revealed the different challenges each front presented. The generational differences among German officers also shaped their assessments. Older generals who had fought in World War I brought different perspectives than younger officers whose military experience began in the Nazi era. The older generation often had more respect for British and American military traditions and were more skeptical of Nazi ideology. Younger officers were more likely to have internalized Nazi racial theories and to view warfare through that ideological lens. These generational tensions within the German officer corps influenced how Allied forces were assessed and discussed. The social and economic backgrounds of German generals influenced their assessments in subtle ways. Officers from aristocratic backgrounds often identified with British officers from similar class backgrounds and found it easier to respect them as professional equals. Officers from middle-class backgrounds were more likely to emphasize professional military competence over social considerations. These class factors, while rarely explicit in German assessments, shaped how German generals related to their Allied counterparts and evaluated their performance. The impact of propaganda on German assessments presents interesting questions. German generals were exposed to constant Nazi propaganda about Allied weaknesses and German superiority. Some internalized these messages, while others maintained professional objectivity despite propaganda. The tension between what German generals knew from battlefield experience and what Nazi propaganda claimed created cognitive dissonance that different officers resolved in different ways. Some clung to propaganda narratives even in the face of contrary evidence, while others became increasingly skeptical of official claims as the war progressed. The role of personal rivalries and institutional conflicts within the German military shaped assessments of Allied forces. Conflicts between Wehrmacht, Waffen-SS and Luftwaffe commanders sometimes influenced how they assessed Allied opponents, with each service claiming superior understanding of enemy capabilities. Rivalries between senior generals affected how they presented information to Hitler and how they wrote about the war afterward. These internal German dynamics must be considered when evaluating German sources. The question of whether German generals truly learned appropriate lessons from their assessments of Allied forces remains debatable. Some German officers clearly recognized the superiority of Allied logistics and systematic approach to warfare. Others continued to emphasize tactical excellence over strategic wisdom. The founding of the Bundeswehr in the 1950s provided an opportunity to apply lessons learned, and West German military doctrine incorporated both German traditions and lessons from studying Allied methods. However, the extent to which individual German generals truly understood why they lost and what could be learned from Allied successes varied considerably. The preservation and availability of German assessments in archives and publications has shaped historical understanding in ways that are not always obvious. German military records were extensively studied by American and British military historians after the war, while Soviet sources remained largely inaccessible until the 1990s. This created an imbalance in available sources that influenced how World War II was understood in the West. German assessments of the Eastern Front, made without access to Soviet sources and filtered through Nazi ideology, were taken as authoritative descriptions of the Soviet military for decades. Only with the opening of Soviet archives could historians develop more balanced understanding. The use of German assessments in post-war military education created both opportunities and problems. On one hand, German tactical and operational methods provided valuable lessons for professional military officers. On the other hand, uncritical acceptance of German assessments perpetuated myths and misunderstandings. Modern military education seeks to use German sources while maintaining critical perspective, recognizing both their value and their limitations. This requires teaching officers to read historical sources critically and to understand the contexts in which they were produced. The contemporary relevance of German assessments extends to modern asymmetric warfare and counterinsurgency operations. Some of the lessons German generals learned about facing numerically superior but differently organized forces have applications to modern military challenges. The importance of initiative at lower levels, the need for rapid adaptation to enemy tactics, and the value of combined arms operations all remain relevant. However, the contexts are so different that direct application of World War II lessons requires careful analysis and adaptation. The digital age has transformed how German assessments are accessed and used. Digitized archives, online databases, and academic publications have made German sources more widely available than ever before. This democratization of access has positive and negative aspects. Professional historians can access primary sources more easily, but so can amateur historians who may lack the critical skills to evaluate them properly. The result is continued circulation of myths and misconceptions based on uncritical reading of German sources, even as professional scholarship becomes more sophisticated. The comparison between German generals' assessments and their actual performance reveals interesting patterns. Generals who criticized Allied caution often failed to achieve decisive victories when given opportunities. Officers who praised Allied logistics struggled to maintain their own supply lines. Commanders who dismissed Allied tactical competence lost battles to the forces they had underestimated. This gap between assessment and reality suggests that German generals sometimes failed to understand the full implications of what they were observing or to apply lessons to their own operations. The role of chance and contingency in shaping German assessments deserves consideration. Individual encounters with particularly competent or incompetent Allied units influence generals' overall assessments. Battles fought in favourable or unfavourable conditions affected perceptions of enemy capabilities. The luck of facing aggressive or cautious Allied commanders shaped German views about Allied leadership quality. These chance factors mean that German assessments represent samples of experience that may not be fully representative of overall Allied performance. The influence of German assessments on subsequent conflicts shows their enduring impact. Israeli military doctrine drew on German operational concepts while adapting them to Israeli circumstances. Soviet military development after World War II incorporated lessons from fighting German forces, while also studying how Allies defeated Germany. American military education in the Cold War emphasized German tactical excellence while teaching how to counter it. These diverse influences demonstrate that German military methods and the assessments German generals made continue to shape military thinking worldwide. What lessons can we draw from examining how German generals viewed Allied commanders? First, that professional military assessment can coexist with ideological blindness, and soldiers must actively work to maintain objectivity. Second, that tactical excellence is necessary but insufficient for victory, and strategic wisdom matters more than brilliant tactics. Third, that different military cultures approach warfare differently, and no single approach is universally superior. Fourth, that material resources and industrial capacity are decisive factors in modern warfare that cannot be overcome by tactical skill alone. Fifth, that coalition warfare requires political and military skills that are different from but equally important as battlefield command. The examination of German assessments also reminds us that history is written by human beings with biases, agendas, and limited perspectives. German generals who wrote about their experiences were not objective observers, but participants with reasons to present events in particular ways. Their assessments contain valuable insights but must be read critically, corroborated with other sources, and understood in their proper contexts. This is true not just for German sources, but for all historical sources, including Allied accounts that have their own biases and limitations. The enduring fascination with German military performance and German assessments of Allied forces reflects broader questions about military excellence, the nature of warfare, and how we remember conflicts. There is something compelling about the story of tactically brilliant but strategically misguided forces defeated by enemies they initially dismissed. It speaks to enduring human interests in skill versus resources, quality versus quantity, and individual excellence versus systematic organization. However, this fascination can become problematic when it leads to romanticization of forces that served an evil cause, or when it obscures the moral dimensions of the conflict. In the end, German generals' assessments of Allied commanders reveal complex mixtures of professional respect, ideological prejudice, self-justification, and genuine insight. They respected Patton for fighting the way they did while benefiting from resources they lacked. They acknowledged British resilience while criticizing British caution. They feared Soviet power while clinging to beliefs about Slavic inferiority. They noted American learning ability while attributing victories to material superiority. These contradictory assessments reflect the contradictions within German military culture and the impossible situation German generals found themselves in. Fighting a war they could not win for a cause many of them either believed in or failed to effectively oppose. The study of these assessments ultimately teaches us as much about the assessors as about those being assessed. It reveals the strengths and limitations of German military thinking, the ways ideology distorted professional judgment, and the challenges of maintaining objectivity when one's career, nation, and life are at stake. It shows how professional soldiers try to make sense of defeat and preserve their sense of competence even as the world they knew collapsed around them. And it reminds us that understanding history requires examining multiple perspectives, questioning sources, and maintaining awareness of the contexts in which historical actors operated. Today, the assessments German generals made of Allied commanders continue to spark debate and discussion. Were they accurate, fair, objective, self-serving? The answer is that they were all of these things to varying degrees, depending on which general, which assessment, and which context we examine. They provide one window into understanding World War II, valuable but incomplete, offering insights that must be balanced against evidence from other sources and perspectives. As we continue to study the war and draw lessons from it, German assessments remain part of the historical record we must grapple with, neither dismissing them as propaganda nor accepting them uncritically as truth. The value of studying these assessments lies not just in understanding what German generals thought, but in recognizing the broader patterns they reveal about military culture, professional judgment, and the challenge of maintaining objectivity in war. Every military organization faces similar challenges today when assessing potential adversaries. The tendency to view enemies through cultural stereotypes, the difficulty of acknowledging enemy strengths without undermining one's own confidence, the temptation to attribute losses to factors beyond one's control. Rather than accepting responsibility, these patterns visible in German assessments remain relevant to modern military professionals. Learning from how German generals succeeded and failed in assessing their opponents can help today's military leaders avoid similar mistakes. The historical record shows that German generals were at their best when assessing Allied tactical and operational capabilities through direct battlefield observation. They recognized Patton's aggressiveness, British defensive tenacity, and Soviet operational sophistication because they experienced these qualities firsthand in combat. However, they were at their worst when ideological prejudice or self-interest distorted their judgment, leading them to underestimate enemies based on racial theories or to blame material factors for defeats rather than acknowledging strategic failures. This mixed record reminds us that even professional military assessment is fallible and must be constantly questioned and refined against evidence and outcomes. The lessons learned from studying these assessments continue to inform military education and strategic thinking today, reminding us of the importance of objectivity in military judgment. Thank you for watching. We hope you found this video informative and thought-provoking. The complex relationship between German and Allied commanders during World War II reveals fundamental truths about military effectiveness, the nature of modern warfare, and how professional soldiers view their opponents even in the midst of total war. Understanding these perspectives helps us appreciate the multifaceted nature of the conflict and the human dimensions behind military strategy. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about the 5 most underrated German generals of World War II. It's a fascinating look into the lives and military careers of some of World War II's most skilled yet overlooked commanders who made significant contributions to German military operations. You'll discover how these generals shaped crucial battles and campaigns while often remaining in the shadows of more famous figures. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. We appreciate your support and look forward to bringing you more historical insights in future videos. See you in the next one.